Hi, I'm Lowell Gustafson, and on behalf of the International Big History Association, I would like to thank Sam Mickey, Mary Evelyn Tucker, and John Grimm for taking the time to talk to us today about the new book that they've just co-edited, Living Earth Community, Multiple Ways of Being and Knowing. So thank you for joining us here.
Good to be here.
And I guess if I could just start out with you asking a question, Mary Evelyn. Of course, you are very well known among big historians for your work on Journey of the Universe. And I guess I'm wondering how you see this current project as related to what you've been working on in the past regarding deep time.
Well, thank you, Lo. Lovely to be here. And as many of you know, Journey of the Universe is a multimedia project, a film, a book, conversations, and online classes, podcasts now too, a website, online curriculum, yeah. And John and I were the executive producers for the film, along with working with Brian Swim on all of these parts. And he, of course, is the main author with me of the book and the film, and the narrator of the film. So that began with the vision of Thomas Berry that a new story was needed, integrating science and humanities and so on. And that's been a long journey of many decades. And it's an ongoing one, and I think an exciting one. And we're delighted that big history is picking up on some of these same themes that Thomas Berry was suggesting many years ago. Namely, humans have to orient themselves into the larger universe in which we live and dwell and have our being, but also out of which we've come. So Journey of the Universe is that invitation to link us up in a continuity of being from cosmos, earth, human, cosmos, earth, life, and human, as big history likes to say. So the point of this edited volume, arising from a conference in October of 2018, is to say there is, amidst the evolution of Earth, the emergence of life and life systems about 500 million years ago, the explosion in the Cambrian period, and so on, linking all of these parts up from worms and reptiles and fish and dinosaurs and birds up to mammals and humans. What we're trying to elevate, I think, is this sense that emergent properties of evolution have led to vibrant and connected communities, so that we live within nested communities of life. We call them ecosystems, and they're dynamic and they're discordant harmonies, as Daniel Botkin called them in his wonderful book. They're in creative disequilibrium. So what we're trying to elevate here is between the 10 billion years of cosmic evolution and 4.5 billion years of Earth's evolution, there is this special moment of the coming into being of a living Earth community. Now we see it at its much later phases here that we are living within. But just to conclude it, because of course there's lots more to say here, but the suggestion is that every being, be it an ecosystem of a forest or fisheries or mountain communities and so on, has arisen from deep time. So that's a first point. And by arising from deep time, it gives us a different way to value it, to understand it, and to be part of it. That's a huge thing. The other is, these are systems communicating with each other. And that's in particular what this book brings forward, the extraordinary and diversified intelligences around us in the fish world, the mammal world, et cetera, in the tree world, communication. So I just want to emphasize those 2 points within Living Earth Community: deep time, evolution, and the communication. The semiotics, biosemiotics of these systems is now being understood. And maybe, if John wants to make an addendum to this, indigenous peoples have understood this for a long time, for sure.
I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of the religion and ecology dimension of this project too, is that we bring to the Living Earth Community book, with all of the diversity of the authors, a sense that there have been multiple ways of knowing and in communities and cultural settings. And we use the word indigenous to indicate these small scale societies that endure into the present, often very robustly, that they have their own ways of talking about this cooperative universe, this sense of communication across. And just to make a final comment before Sam comes in, I'm particularly interested in the porosity of that divide, that long-standing divide between organic and inorganic. And I think it's very interesting the way Indigenous and other communities, say in the religious world, that they've crossed those boundaries and seen ways in which the mineral world or the lithosphere, to use that kind of language, has been in constant communication, support, cooperation with the living world.
Thank you. Sam, maybe I could follow up on a point that John just makes regarding the organic and the inorganic world. How should we think about this idea of animate and inanimate nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. All the divides that we make up when we're thinking about humans and their place on Earth, one of the most persistent is this divide between the inanimate and the animate, the living and the non-living. And one of the things that this book is really putting into question is how stable that boundary really is. And that when you look at that from different traditions, you see people locating it in different ways. And you really see that it's not so thin and rigid of a boundary as it might seem. And, some people are going to go so far as to say everything's alive. But there's also the possibility that things might show up as alive depending upon the way you relate to it. Right? That, the kind of story of saying, well, are you saying all these stones are alive? Like, no, some of them are. You just have to engage, and the relationships that you build with it might draw out a certain liveliness of things. But we're finding liveliness even in the basic fundamental building blocks of the material world. And so when you think about like quantum events, like that's pretty lively stuff, even if it's just atomic or molecular and not yet a living organism. Still a liveliness to it, or kind of animacy to it. So some of it is learning to speak a new language about animacy that opens up the possibilities that the living and the non-living world might be able to blend into one another a little bit more. So I think about like Robin Wall Kimmerer saying we need to learn to speak the grammar of animacy. So that's why we're going so far as to call the book Living Earth Community, and to kind of make that a little bit easier for people to say. A few decades ago when Gaia theory first showed up, the idea of saying Earth is alive was controversial. It seems this kind of very bold suggestion. And the more we're consulting other traditions and other ways of knowing, we're seeing that's really not that bold of a suggestion. We're just needing to get used to learning how to speak that way. So then all of these chapters are providing some resources for us to learn to engage with that kind of grammar.
John, you were mentioning Indigenous communities who are among the groups that you are including in the book. And of course, the subtitle of the book is Multiple Ways of Being and Knowing. I'd like to ask you or all of you just about this idea of multiple ways of knowing. I mean, we have so much discussion about epistemology and knowing facts and believing myth. And how should we think about knowing through different cultural traditions that are not scientific in the way that we understand that sometimes?
Yes, during the conference, I had the wonderful pleasure of meeting Jeanette Armstrong. And Jeanette and I shared a personality in common. I have attended the winter dance among Okanagan peoples for some years back. And it was in that setting that I met her uncle. And his name in Okanagan, Sin Pak Chin, first light at the morning. It was Martin Louis, his name in English. It was Martin Louis who first alerted me to the character of sound and listening as a way of knowing in his tradition. And his basic point was sound is, to use philosophical or conceptual language, Sound had a metaphysical character to it. Everything in reality had that vibrancy to it, and it communicated its interiority in terms of sound. And so as a way of listening to the world, as a way of hearing the world, I think he was trying to suggest to me this whole ceremonial that you're attending, the winter dance from the December time into March, this ceremonial is for our people, a way of transmitting that teaching, where they listen to the songs that others would sing, that in which they had engaged the world in the way that Sam was just talking about, that sense of the possibility of the world that when one enters the relationship in a meaningful way. And just to conclude, I found it very interesting that many indigenous peoples from Lakota and what we now call South Dakota to Maori people, they have a fundamental symbolic statement in which stone is the basic metaphysical of the dynamic character of the universe. I find it so interesting that these very different, very diverse, one of Pacific Island peoples and one in the middle of the North American continent, that same recognition that there is something about the permanency and the solidity of stone that still communicates to them the vitality and the dynamic movement of the universe. I find it very paradoxical and interesting.
If I could just, sorry, pick up on that. Uluru in central Australia, this huge, huge rock that is sacred. And we've been fortunate to be there, and it is extraordinary. And there's many places in the West for Native peoples, rock formations and so on that are sacred. David Haberman, a participant in the conference and in the book, has written his own book on Hinduism and rocks and so on. And in the Chinese tradition, from jade and the hardness of jade and minerals and so on, and these extraordinary formations in Guilin and elsewhere of rocks, and the rocks that are formed for Zen gardens that come in very unusual shapes. So this profound sense that rocks have their own vitality, and we don't quite have the language to describe it. Why is it when we go to the beach, we pick up rocks and shells and stones and we collect them? So that's what we're trying to, it's ancient and it's part of us as well, this sense of the numinous, actually, in these forms.
Sam, and let me ask you to, following up on this question, how do you see this as maybe influencing our educational system? We talk all the time in education about reading skills, critical reading words, reading language, speaking skills, writing. We talk a great deal about how to write words. We place great attention to language. But now Mary Evelyn and John are talking about not just listening to lectures and reading words, but listening and watching and interacting with the natural world. What does this mean for our educational system?
Right, yeah. Well, it means our educational system has a lot of changes it needs to start thinking about. And yeah, I mean, one point, an easy example would be learning about water. And you can learn so much from reading books and from doing chemical analysis. And we can get this great definition of water as hydrogen and oxygen, right? H2O. And you have this big O with a couple little H's. It's like a mouse, right? And people can remember that, and you get a sense of the dynamics of water accordingly. And we can think like, why is water such that it's easy for ships to pass over it on the Atlantic? It's because of the molecular structure, right? But imagine having all that knowledge, but never having gotten wet, right? And there's something that happens if I jump in a pool or a river or a lake, and I experience water in a very different way. And it's not less true than H2O. It's just a different kind of truth, right? It's this interactive or participatory truth. I get a different sense for what water is, how it relates to me, how it relates to the things around it, and how we generally operated with the kind of modern educational model is that in order to really focus on the brilliant things we come up with H2O, we have to not get wet anymore. And we had to kind of push that stuff out of our educational model. And we're just saying, let's bring it back and have this kind of more integrative approach to education. We can still learn that water is H2O, but we can still learn about the different ways that people feel water in their day-to-day lives, the way they interact with it, and see that as its own kind of truth, right? And the ways that people attend to it in rituals. Water rituals are a different experience of water, a different understanding of the truth of water. And just because it's communicated with story doesn't mean it's less true. It just means it's a truth that's expressed in a different form. So we're trying to bring all of those things together so people learn to have like an emotional connection with water, as well as a cognitive connection, as well as different ways of speaking about it, different ways of imagining it, to try and bring all of those together so that we really start to understand the fullness of what something as simple as water could be.
Yeah. I guess let me ask you to pursue that just a bit more. Maybe Mary Evelyn, if you're willing to talk about this, the role of language in our relationship with nature. I mean, we are such linguistic beings. So we just love words, but I think you're pointing that there's a certain limitation maybe to language. And so I guess just help me explore that idea a little bit about this relationship between our love of language and our relationship to nature.
Wonderful questions, Lowell, all of them. Thank you. So, I think perhaps the nature writers understand this best, right? We're historians of religion and so on, and Sam's got a great philosophy of religion background, and so we have academic training, but those who have a poetic sensibility, let's start there, have a sense that language functions in very different ways than description only or prescription. But it involves what Sam was just saying, a different sense of imagination, of ways of being, of ways of knowing that are sensual, that are sensing, minding, creating. John likes to say this is all mingling. And if I could just be specific and give an example, I think what's exploding is these different ways of knowing in animal cognition, the songs of animals, the migrations of animals and birds and fish. I'd love to come back to that. But I also just wanted to hold up what's really coming into our consciousness about trees and forests and roots and the soil of forests and so on. This is quite thrilling. Some of it's been known, of course, in the scientific world, but through works like Robin Kimmerer referred to earlier, but also David Haskell, who has this beautiful book, The Song of Trees. Back to your point of listening. He is really listening to trees and from all different parts of the world. And this brings alive a sense trees are saying something. And he uses, the term song and so on. But we have this book, The Hidden Life of Trees. How are they communicating? And a third one I'd like to hold up is Edward Cohn, who's part of this book and this conference. He did an amazing book called How Forests Think, that there's a Eduardo Cohn. There's a biosemiotics of the communication. And with forests and the trees and soil, I'll just say very briefly, we know now how fungi linked to the roots, draw minerals for the tree, and the tree also feeds the fungi. So the symbiotic relationship, and then the signals that are given when there's pests and so on in the area. This is communication of a different sort. So it's not only humans who think and communicate. There's different forms of sentience in the world in which we live. And that's extremely exciting, I think.
I love also Cynthia Brown's use of the word threshold, or actually in big history, broadly speaking, that opening that the discipline of big history opens to someone who encounters this perspective of livingness or aliveness, the vitality embedded in a pre-linguistic possibility. And that possibility, having come to us, remains, it opens to us a sense of thresholds that we have crossed in our human domain, but that opens us also to the recovery or an awareness of what has brought us to this threshold that we've crossed. So these are contributions I think Big History is making available to so many people.
Yeah, and just a quick footnote. David Abram, wrote this book, The Spell of the Sensuous, to try and awaken this. And he says it's primary and before language that we have these connections. He was also at this conference. And Paul Wadeau, who's done amazing work with animals, especially the great apes and so on, he's also pressing for this sense of other forms of consciousness in the animal world.
Yeah, haptic, the touch, especially.
In the book Living Earth Community, you're talking about a community of people and nature, and then different groups of people. So there are different types of communities that you're talking about. But including this idea of the Earth community. Very traditionally in our Western philosophical tradition, we've talked about the fact-value distinction. The sciences and the study of nature gives us factual knowledge, which is different from values. But community, it implies relationship and mutual obligation. I guess I'm just wondering how should we think about this relationship between nature, relationship, obligation, ethics? How do we put these things together as opposed to distinguishing fact and value as two very separate and unrelated topics?
We should have Sam jump in here.
Yeah, that's the tough question, Sam. You take
you do it.
Yeah, well, and that's one of my favorites too, really, because it's so important to keep like fact claims and normative claims distinct. Like saying what something is very different than saying how we ought to relate to it. And yet, when we talk about what is, we're already motivated by our own values, of course, right? Why study one phenomenon and not another? Why are we applying a certain method? We're being motivated by values. So that's the kind of basic point, that all theories are value laden, right? That all constructions of facts come from values. But it's still a little different than that point of when I'm talking about a fact of a molecule, does the molecule have value? And this is one of the things that environmental philosophers especially have been pushing on for a long time, saying it seems like what we're finding is value in nature. And an easy example of that would be something like genes. Genes code. We use the language of code to talk about genetic material. So there's already code, which means there's already meaning or value. There's already a selection process, right? Choosing one thing, not another thing. There's something like discernment or decision making, in that really basic sense of decision, just meaning cutting away, right? Choosing one thing and not another. So then it seems like nature itself has intrinsic value, and that's something we learn by understanding the facts, right? That just looking at the facts of what genes are, we discover value. And so in that sense, the fact-value distinction never just implodes. And sometimes it's just too easy to do that and just say, well, it's all one anyway, right? Like, no, there's real differences. And yet they come much closer together than a lot of the history of ethics thought. The history of ethics from Aristotle through Kant always really thought that value is pretty much located solely within the human, and that anything we find in the natural world, those are just brute facts. And brute fact meant devoid of value. And then what we've seen, especially through 20th century sciences and environmental philosophy, and then multicultural studies looking at indigenous traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., we see more and more people saying, it looks like the facts themselves have values built in. Whether you're looking at native science, modern science, we increasingly find that. So finding that trees are communicating, finding that our genes have code, we're finding value everywhere, which makes ethics almost impossible, because if everything's valuable, how do you decide like what to eat, right? We have to make a mess somewhere, right? You can't love everything. If I'm gonna love my cat, I have to get the fleas off my cat. If I love the fleas, I'll introduce them to the cat. You have to make choices. So now there's scales of value everywhere. Subatomic value, the value of the universe, galaxies, living organisms, ecosystems. So yeah, really environmental ethics in that sense really pushes ethics to the breaking point. But I find that exciting because it makes decision making harder, but you're living in this magical, wondrous world. So it makes decision making a lot more enjoyable.
And I would say a major system that's not well known in the West, namely Confucianism, has very central to its philosophical and practical way of being is moral value is in the world. And this great Western inscription of heaven is my father, earth is my mother, even such a small child as I has a place in the midst. That which directs the universe I regard as my nature. And then this compassion for all living things. You can't isolate this. The dualisms that have split us apart are not actually compatible with certain ways of thinking in other parts of the world, including indigenous and so on. But Sam is so right that this isn't simple, but it is the case that value, not just in a moral action sense, again, we're expanding our ways of being and thinking. This is the multiple ways of being and knowing, to say some kind of value is in these systems. And we've got to have our own philosophy and ethics and religious ways of thinking catch up to this. And that's what's exciting. And that's part of the offering of this book. It doesn't provide all the answers here, but just opening up the questions.
And I'm intrigued as an investigator of the world, having lived in the world now for my 73 years, I'm intrigued with the character of the ethics that Sam is describing and that we were exploring in this conference that resulted in the Living Earth Community book, that this uncertainty that faces us and that seems to come out of the universe calling for our choice, our decision making, it seems so appropriate in our day. It's as if this is our responsibility to awake, to acknowledge what it is that is facing us, this arc of uncertainty and decision making. And one example that I found very intriguing is, if I have the ethicist right, Holmes Ralston, is that he provides such an interesting example of this fact-value porosity when he talks about the ecologist, especially the restoration ecologist, who engages in what Sam put out to us as the facts of the ecosystem, and engaging the facts and dealing with the facts, and suddenly coming to the value determination. What is it about this ecosystem that I hope to restore, or that I ought to restore? And suddenly the fact value becomes totally mutually illuminating, one to the other. And it is an act of uncertainty. And I think that's part of the confrontation and challenge that many restoration ecologists face nowadays. It's this frank realization that we are about restoring something that reflects our values in relation to this ecosystem. We're caught up in the triadic decision making here.
Just following up on this, you and Mary Evelyn, the book talks about the different cultural groups' ways of being and knowing. It talks about the different natural systems, the way forests think and know and relate to each other. In following up your point, John, about choice, what do you see is the value of knowing the multiple ways of being and knowing? What should we take from this book? What value does this knowledge have for me as a reader of this material?
If I could just jump in, I think Thomas Berry had this wonderful phrase, of course, that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. So the subjectivity, the interiority, the emergent properties, the complex movements are something that we're beginning to discover. And John was just talking about restoration. Well, the UN is about to announce a decade-long years of restoration ecology. Now, we have to restore ecosystems, whether they're wetlands or rivers and so on. But to do that, we have to understand how they work, not just through a scientific reductionist or engineering or technological framework. All of that may be necessary. No one denies that, but it's not sufficient. So what we're trying to say, we need to expand our knowledge base so that we include how have indigenous peoples, for example, thought about the birds, the herbs, the native plants in their area, and there's the weather, etc. So multiple ways of knowing. It's not just a romantic or nature-loving mysticism or something. It actually has practical value too. And so I would just say there's resilience in the human from knowing and drawing in other ways of knowing, because frankly, this is going towards planetary health, and we can't have healthy people on a sick planet. So we need these ways of knowing for sure. So it's resilience for people and the planet, and moving towards mutually enhancing human-Earth relations. Again, that was Thomas Berry's idea, mutually enhancing human-Earth relations.
Sam, did you have some thoughts about this question?
Yeah, well, it's hard to add anything to that. That I had all those thoughts.
We've been reading the same people.
Let me ask you, Sam, the question in just a slightly different way, and that is, what are your hopes for what this book will achieve? What's the value of the book is another way of saying it. In other words, why did you spend all of this time and effort producing this book?
Yeah, well, I think one of the main things is a sense of community building, and in the immediate sense, that's a sense of community between all the contributors, at the conference and working together, putting the book together, and but it's also that the reader is part of that community as well, and by extension, the reader gets to feel like they're part of this larger Earth community. And in general, whatever I'm working on, I'm trying to fight loneliness. The individualism that plagues so much of modern society, the kind of atomized individual self that feels disconnected from other people, disconnected from the earth, disconnected from the cosmos, with no sense of purpose or meaning. There's so many easy ways out of that problem to find connection. And those connections are everywhere. And so it turns out that there's so many more possibilities. And people might feel like they're locked into something that they really can't escape from. Then here's this book saying, actually, look at all the different ways of being that our cultures and our ecosystems have generated throughout our history and our evolution. And you can plug into those. And you can learn to listen to people and listen to places that you might not have known. And so even, just learning to hear the birds outside your window, and you go, okay, what bird is it? Oh, that's a robin. Now I feel like me and this robin have a relationship. And so I feel a little more connected. And so whether that's at that small scale, or whether that's feeling like you're part of a global community that's multicultural, complex, the emergent dynamics of Gaia, right? So from the very small to the very large, you can be part of something more. And the more that you're part of something, the more we have a team effort, right? We have global-sized environmental problems. We have global-sized economic and cultural problems. So we need globally coordinated solutions. And so then this book is one offering for how to speak the kind of language and kind of feel the feelings necessary for these kind of globally coordinated solutions.
And Lowell, one dimension that all three of us share is that this book is open source.
Yes.
Book. And it was Mark Turin who was also at the conference and spoke so clearly of the linguistic question and moving it. Mark helped us to find Open Book as the publisher. And this sense of having a publication which now reaches around the planet and is made available to people without that barrier of the monetary commitment. So that's I think, very important part of our feeling about this book and what we were intending to do with this book.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it's our first open source book, and I think with Sam as well, who's published a lot, by the way. His books are great. You should check them out. But what was I love Sam's point about community, because we've done I don't know, maybe 30 some conferences. And this was actually so special because of Sam's point. These are very, very gifted people with a poetic sensibility, anthropology knowledge, scientific knowledge. It was hosted by our former dean, Peter Crane, who's a great botanist on this Bunny melon estate where the gardens are extraordinary. And she learned all of this very intuitively. But I would say it's just, 25 people. It was small and intimate, but it was an explosion of energy along the lines that Sam was mentioning, of people who are like, oh, I'm not just working in my little space. People understand what I've been trying to think about. And one example is Julianne Warren, who picks up on this bird. I don't know if you want to tell the story of the Maori. Yeah. And so a bird has gone extinct, and there's a living person who remembered the song of this bird. And so her presentation on this song and the memory of the Maori of this bird and what it means culturally, this linking of people back to time, even to something that's extinct. It was amazing, riveting.
Yeah, I think it's even more complicated, that it might have been the recording of a sound of a Maori who is now deceased, and this
Yes.
Julianne Warren was an investigation into the genealogy of sound.
Yeah.
Just, a marvelous piece.
The emphasis on community is so striking to me because Sam was talking about this sense of alienation, separation, loneliness, perhaps, and we have that notion of separation so deep within society. I mean, we talk about the nature-nurture division, or nature culture, or human. We sometimes see differences in how nature is seen in relationship or non-relationship with people in art. Sometimes we have cultural traditions which place a very small human within a very large natural setting, and others which have the close-up of the face, and then nature is just sort of a bit of an irrelevant background to this. But we have all of this emphasis on separation of humans from nature, and so how do we achieve this sense of a community between humans and nature, along with other groups, as opposed to it's pushing back against one of the themes which is being discussed so much now about the rise of populism and nationalism and separation of peoples, just exactly the opposite of what you're kind of pushing back against here in this book. So we have this enormous tension about, are we developing an Earth community, or are we fragmenting in this current politics that we're facing?
Yes.
How can we push back against the rising separation that we seem to experience?
Yeah, I sense this, the face that comes out of your question to me, Lowell, is the face of alienation in our attention to our economic our modes of production, and especially the Marxist analysis of alienation, how powerful and how very gripping it is in our division of labor, and the sense of the natural world itself and our separation that Marx was attentive to. And I'm reminded of Richard Nelson's lovely book, Make Prayers to the Raven, where he speaks of the Koyukon peoples in the subarctic and their sense of a watchful world. So rather than an alienation from the mode of production, the Koyukon had a sense of the world as watching, and it was how one went about behavior in the midst of that watchful world. And I feel that we're encountering these questions in our own modes, which big history makes relevant, I think, because they are questions of time for us. It's not just the watchful world, or it's not just the world of alienation, but it's an awareness, a growing awareness of the depth of time that we have come out of. And I think that sense of the wonder, as well as the absolute fear of that time dimension causes people to fall back into these identities of security, such as nationalisms or local communities that retreat into their own interiority. But the long allure and call of time in the big history that we are confronts us with all of its uncertainty.
Sam, how about you? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rise of populism and nationalism is correct that the global economy isn't working for people, right? And so then what do you do when the global civilization that we built is obviously unsustainable, and then people retreat back to the last thing they ever knew? So, oh, let's go back to this smaller, more isolated provincial form of social organizing. And what if there was an alternative where instead of the global economy, and instead of these kind of protective, isolated populisms, what if people connected to the earth? Not the globe, whatever the global economy was, but the actual earth, which has this deep time dimension. And then all of a sudden, when people are wanting to connect with their community, your community opens up into earth history, it opens up into the stars. And so that's going to make it a little harder to be an ethno-nationalist. Right? So they're totally right in rejecting the global economy, but we want to provide an alternative that isn't restricting people further or being politically regressive, but an alternative that actually opens people out further into the richness of the whole universe.
I think that's so great. Just really quickly, because you may have another question, Lo, but my grandfather was a historian of Europe at Columbia University, and he helped begin the field of nationalism, and his last book was Nationalism, a Religion. And you know, we all know 2 world wars in Europe came out of nationalism, and the same for the Pacific Wars and so on. So we know that's not working in addition to this global economy. And yet, as we all understand the safety, what John was saying too, fundamentalism in religion, fundamentalism in politics, it's a similar mindset. Mine, being with my group, my community, the fear, and this breaking down moment that we're all experiencing, yet hopefully to break through to different forms of community out of the fossilization politically and economically and religiously and even educationally. So it's a painful moment, but it's also a moment when we are sharing with the whole planet illness, health, possibility, despair, hope. It's all threaded throughout. And just to echo what Sam said and John said, the Earth community can ground us in a whole different sensibility. That's the hope here for the Living Earth Community book and ideas.
Maybe just kind of wrapping things up a little bit. Communities are very often those groups that have shared stories. You know, we just know what the stories are, and we repeat them around the Thanksgiving table, even though we've all heard them many times. What is the Earth story that we all share in community? What story does nature tells us that Earth is telling us that helps nurture a living community?
Sam, do you want to jump in, or John? You were about to say. Go ahead.
I was thinking of Thomas Spear's use of the news story, and his perspective was resonant and in sync with Big History's perspective too, that the Earth story is part of a much larger story, but our most immediate experience of the larger cosmic story is this Earth. And I'm reminded of what I just heard today through an online conversation reporting an Indigenous Haudenosaunee woman who was speaking of the body of Mother Earth. And she was talking about extractive economies, and that we don't really know what it means when we take something out of the earth. We have a feeling of our own body. And if you extract my liver from my body, I feel it. I know its effect on me. And she says, we don't know what it means yet to have extracted these minerals, ores, and materials out of the earth. And so I think that's one story told in its own way by a Haudenosaunee Iroquois woman of this of reflecting about the activities that humans impose upon the earth.
Sam, jump in.
Yeah, one of the things part of the idea for me would be not only that the earth has a story, but that it is a story, right? That it is a time developmental process with a beginning, with some kind of middle that we're in now and some kind of future orientation. And so if we're part of a story, then we have life is a plot, right? Both in the spatial sense of a plot of land, but that the plot of land I'm part of has its own plot, its own story, its own narrative. And so again, if we're thinking, how do you help people have a sense of community and connection? You show them that they are already part of a story. And so the universe ceases to be a background or like some kind of stage on which humans play out their drama and live out our stories. And Earth and the universe stop being a stage and they start being part of the story. So now nothing's a stage. There's only story. There's only the play. There's only the plot. So then the resources for meaning and purpose are everywhere.
I love that. If I could just maybe punctuate these two, because we do want to say it's not the story, it's a story, Journey of the Universe, or it's going to be told in multiple voices and song, the oratorio at the Big History Conference of Sam Guanashia and so on. So there's going to be lots of tellings of this, and that's the exciting part. But I do want to say that you know, one of the documents that's come forward in the last 20 years is the Earth Charter. We're just about to celebrate the 20th year of that. And we value, of course, our Declaration of Independence here in the US, and we're very independently minded along with the European tradition of that. But you know, the fact that we actually have, and that took almost 10 years to bring forward, but a declaration of interdependence of our ecological integrity, social economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace in a context that we are part of a vast evolving universe. Those are the lines, and Earth itself is alive with a myriad community of life. That is a very exciting and promising moment, just that we have that document. And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish here, but I think the authors in this book, the talent that they represent, Sam in the next generation, you know, is an exciting partner in this work, and that's what this book is also about, an intergenerational handshake to say, we can do something together, can't we? So we really have a shout out to Sam for doing a lot of this work with us. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all three of you, Sam Mickey, Mary Evelyn Tucker, John Grimm, and all of the authors for having given us Living Earth Community, Multiple Ways of Being and Knowing. Thank you for our conversation today.
Thanks to you, Lowell. These are fine questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this was great. Just exciting material, and I appreciate your taking the time to share this and introduce it to the rest of us here.
You're a great interviewer, boy. You really had us. When I looked at those questions, I was like, how are we ever going to answer them because they were so good? And
well, you took care of all of them.
I don't know. But Sam he's so placid and wonderful. He just jumps into the most difficult ones.
Lowell, do we have your permission to use your questions in other settings? I find
you can do whatever you want with them. Yeah, it's not as good as your book, but use them as you like. Yeah. So. Well,
we're so pleased you picked up on this. And before we jump off, just tell us, how are you doing? And you know, is life okay for you in Philadelphia?
You know, I mean, so far, knock on wood, we're healthy, we're doing well. I mean, we still live in so-called our red zone. You know, in Pennsylvania, our governor has outlined the red, the yellow, and the green zones of the state, and we're unfortunately, the southeast is in the red zone. So certainly, there's a lot of people who are suffering from this.
Yeah.
And what that means for our future in my own university, we don't know. We were online in the spring and now in the summer, and what will happen in the fall, we're still waiting to learn. And so it's a singular experience.
Right.
Us have had this before. But as you mentioned, there are some silver linings in this. This is an Earth experience. This is a human experience now.
Right. Right.
And it's still Janus-faced because it points in opposite directions for the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we very much hope that your book can contribute to the right direction that it could take.
Yeah. Well,
good.
well, no, I was just going to say these authors are extremely talented. And back to Sam's point, it was quite amazing how much they loved just being together for a couple days, because overcoming that isolation, you know, and so bringing that together was part of the book, you know, that such talent of these folks.
And also, Lowell, it's hard to do all the backstory before the conference actually started. We went out on the eclipse last year. We went to Oak Spring to the conference 2 years ago. And there was this amazing sound in the air. There was a gathering in celebration of the eclipse. And so I was asking around finally of the gardeners who were there, because it was a celebratory moment. We were having a glass of beer and Kool-Aid or whatnot, or lemonade. And someone, when I asked about the sound, they said, well, you have to talk with that young fellow with the beard. He was a music and ethnomusicology and some science major also. He had attached sound sensors to a sunflower plant, a rather large sunflower, and he was attuning to prepare when the total eclipse came, or it was close to total in Virginia, the change in sound. And so the sound that I was hearing was the sound being produced by this sunflower.
And you know, I was amazed because we went down to the Philadelphia Flower Show and had done this. They had hooked up these plants which were singing a chorus. It was amazing.
Oh wow! was this last year? I presume not this year.
Yes. Yeah, it was last year, and I've never seen that before, and it was just mesmerizing.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, that's what's exciting. This is kind of exploding us out of our academic but you know, and Sam, does this all resonate? I'm sure in California you're so far ahead of the East Coast, so people have been thinking about this, right?
That's true. Yeah, we're listening to sunflowers sing all the time.
Well, I had never heard him sing before, so
but I actually do mean, I think the ideas in the book, right, would resonate with a lot of.
Oh yeah, most definitely. Yeah, that's all the multiculturalism, the ecological awareness, the sense of deep time. Yeah, that's very much the values of this area. One of the reasons it's hard for me to leave the Bay Area. It's nice to be around such like-minded people.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, anyway, thank you again. Thanks for your time.
Oh,
thank you.
We'll look forward to the next get together.
All right, and keep up your great work with Big History.
It's great fun. I'm having a ball with it.
That's great. Thank you so
much.
All
best, Lowell.
And bye, Sam.
See you, Sam.
Bye-bye, Sam.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye now.